Summer 1944, the East Coast of the United States. The military train moved forward with a metallic silence along the tracks. But inside its cars there weren't armed soldiers. There were women in gray uniforms, exhausted, their hands still marked by the daily contact with the wounded and the amputated. They were German nurses, captured in Italy only weeks before, now sent on a journey that seemed to defy every logic of war. When they stepped off at the improvised station, they expected barbed wire, harsh guards, a warehouse of iron and concrete like the ones they knew back home. Instead, what they saw was the steady glow of electric lights, all turned on, without fear of air raids. Ahead of them, a convoy of trucks was unloading crates stamped with the Red Cross and the words, U.S. Medical Department. Endless crates, stacked as if sheer abundance itself had become a weapon of war. The smell of disinfectant drifted from the open doors of the warehouses. Inside, long rows of new stretchers, neatly folded, waited for patients who might never come. Carts filled with rolls of pristine bandages, still sealed, stood in stark contrast to the nurses' most recent memories. Gauze boiled and washed in buckets, reused until it turned to rags. Glass bottles pressed into service as serum containers. Syringes passed from one soldier to another, out of necessity. What for them had been painful rationing, here seemed available to anyone's hand. In the first corridor, one German nurse picked up a translucent vial of penicillin. Not just one, but dozens, lined up as if they were everyday items on a grocery shelf. The shock wasn't only in what they saw. The sounds struck them as well. Ceiling fans turning, the steady hum of refrigeration keeping medicines at controlled temperatures. None of this existed in the Wehrmacht's field hospitals, where heat made fluids evaporate and bodies rot faster. Here, even the air itself seemed to serve medicine. The contrast was almost insulting. They had heard propaganda insisting Americans were disorganized, spoiled, unable to endure hardship. Yet what stood before them was another kind of discipline, quiet, unspoken, order not enforced by shouting or strict rules, but by perfectly aligned shelves, unshakable stockpiles, and the calm confidence of people who knew nothing would ever run out. Some nurses looked away, others stood frozen, unable to hide their disbelief. For women who had lived through blackout nights, where even the glow of a candle could invite destruction, the full brightness of these corridors felt almost offensive. Here, there was no fear of darkness, no trace of shortage, only endless halls that seemed inexhaustible, as if even war itself could not consume such reserves. In the heavy silence, each step echoed with memories of the scarcity they had endured. Amputations done without enough anesthesia, soldiers screaming under blood-soaked sheets, improvisations that left scars as lasting as the bullets. Now, faced with shelves that never seemed to end, the paradox revealed itself. The United States treated abundance as routine, while they had learned to treat scarcity as fate. German propaganda had spoken of Western decay, yet here was an image that tore that story apart. Not the might of a tank or the roar of a bomber, but the white silence of clean sheets, the cold gleam of new surgical instruments, the quiet promise that there would always be more. The scene felt unreal, almost impossible. These women who thought they had already seen everything on devastated fronts realized there were still horizons they could not grasp. And as they walked under the lights, the rhythmic hum of the fans became the soundtrack of a larger discovery, something they could not yet name, but that the coming days would make clear. The corridor seemed endless, and perhaps, for them, it was only the beginning of another kind of war. The secret wasn't in the stacked crates, but in the machinery that kept them arriving without end. At dawn, the German nurses could see the movement in the yard. Cranes unloading railroad cars, army trucks, all painted olive green and numbered with precision, lining up as if obeying an invisible score. Each vehicle carried the same seal, the same lettering, the same reinforced wooden packaging. It was the direct result of a system that didn't rely on improvisation, a flow fed by assembly lines thousands of miles away, transforming raw cotton, rubber, and steel into identical bandages, syringes, and scalpels, interchangeable and always ready. When a crate was opened, there was no surprise. Inside, gauze rolled into steam-sealed packs, ampules labeled with expiration dates, instruments wrapped in waxed paper. Nothing looked handmade. Everything bore the stamp of calculated repetition. One German nurse ran her fingers over the smooth surface of a new clamp, still smelling of factory oil. It wasn't like the instruments of the Reich, each one coming from local workshops, all slightly different, forcing the hand to adapt. Here, everything fit the same way, in any hospital, in any state. While they had been used to slow requisitions from regional military pharmacies, here the supplies flowed like water through pipes, invisible, but constant. The metallic clatter of lids being pried open mixed with the hum of a distant generator. Inside the warehouse, large refrigerators kept serums and vaccines at controlled temperatures. An American soldier, in a simple uniform, adjusted a thermostat and jotted notes on a clipboard, as if it were just another shift. To the prisoners, used to improvising with blocks of ice in wooden boxes, this was a revelation. Consistency mattered as much as the medicine itself. The method produced not only abundance, but trust. Nothing here seemed left to luck or chance. Discipline didn't come from an officer's shouting, but from the silent cadence of the operation. Trucks arrived, unloaded, departed. Others waited at the gate, engines running, ready to repeat the cycle. The air filled with the smell of gasoline and freshly opened wood. The effect was immediate. No soldier had to ask where a crate should go. No nurse hesitated over a vial's origin. Standardization erased doubt. The contrast was inescapable. While German field hospitals fought for every delivery, here the American routine turned war into industrial continuity. The Germans, still trying to hold their posture, began to exchange quick glances. The stiffness in their shoulders gave way to a silent realization. This mechanism couldn't be dismissed as propaganda. It was tangible, in the wood, in the metal, in the steady chill of the refrigerators. Every detail proved that the abundance they had seen the day before was no accident, but the result of a process that would repeat endlessly. And although nothing yet threatened them directly, an unspoken question was already hanging in the air. What would happen when this same mechanism was pushed into even harsher arenas? The first test came on home soil, still in the summer of 1944. At a military hospital near Baltimore, the German nurses were taken to observe the recovery ward. Outside, the humid Atlantic air buzzed with insects, and the sweet scent of trees mingled with the asphalt's heat. Inside, however, the atmosphere was different. Corridors cooled by metal ducts, fresh air blowing steadily, supply carts gliding noiselessly on oiled wheels. A stretcher was wheeled into surgery. 2 soldiers followed with trays of brand new instruments, still wrapped in waxed paper. The moment one IV ran out, another was connected without hesitation, as if the staff had anticipated the need seconds earlier. Efficiency came through repetition, almost like an assembly line. One German nurse, used to making do with scraps, watched an American colleague change disposable gloves, new for every procedure, and felt the contrast cut into her like an invisible wound. What had always been a battle against scarcity for them, here turned into an unbreakable dance of fluidity. The distant sound of rain marked the second scene. Autumn 1944, an advanced base on the coast of newly liberated France. The ground was pure mud, the air heavy with salt and spilled fuel. Under the canvas of a field hospital, the test was tougher. Hostile weather, unstable ground, the pressure of evacuating wounded arriving in endless waves. Yet the same system repeated itself. Standardized crates, opened in sequence, revealed dry bandages untouched by the damp. Generators roared steadily, powering electric lamps that lit the tent like a permanent hospital ward. The contrast was striking. While Germans relied on kerosene lanterns and clumsy improvisations in the dark, here the lamps kept surgeons' hands steady even through the storm. The rhythm was clear. An American nurse called out a crate code. Another delivered it within seconds, no hesitation, no searching. No, the Germans, guarded but close enough to watch, realized abundance wasn't limited to the safety of the rear. Even in the mud, the system moved with the same cadence, as if the outside chaos had no power to break it. The final transition came at nightfall, carried by the low thunder of continuous engines. Winter 1945, at the port of New York, where the cold stung the skin and every breath turned white. The nurses, by now months in captivity, were sent with other prisoners to do light cleaning tasks in the medical warehouses on the docks. It was the largest scene they had ever witnessed. Rows of Liberty ships anchored, each one loaded with tons of identical supplies, ready to cross the Atlantic. Searchlights cut through the darkness, cranes lifted containers and lowered them smoothly onto waiting trucks. The dominant smell was burnt oil, mixed with the icy tang of steel chains. The rhythm never stopped. Shift after shift, men rotated without breaking the operation's cadence. For the prisoners, the realization was unavoidable. This was not chance, nor a momentary display. Abundance was held up by an invisible, predictable method, as solid as the steel of the ships lined along the pier. As they watched a crane slowly lower a red cross-marked crate onto a deck, they understood that this cycle could go on indefinitely. What they were witnessing was no isolated spectacle, but a pattern that, sooner or later, would be measured in numbers impossible to ignore. 12 hours of continuous electric light in every ward, a white brightness that never dimmed, even when the city outside sank into blackout. The hum of the filaments was constant, as if each bulb were a silent sentinel. For those who came from German hospitals where even the flame of a lantern had to be hidden under cloth, the difference burned in their eyes. 3,000 calories a day, served on metal trays. The smell of fresh coffee rose from the kitchens, mixed with the steam of scrambled eggs and bacon. Every morning, the same abundance repeated. Across the Atlantic, German soldiers counted crumbs and rationed chicory in thin water. Here, energy was offered in excess, as if it would never run out. 8 hot showers running at once in each prisoner block. The sound of water hitting tile echoed like steady thunder, and steam formed clouds that fogged the mirrors. One German nurse could not look away. To her, the idea of daily baths was almost a fantasy. 40 kilometers of track separated the port from the nearest camp, and still the trains arrived on time. The whistle cut the air with military punctuality, the cars clean, the seats upholstered. While German convoys were delayed for days on bombed-out lines, here every trip seemed guided by an invisible metronome. 1 doctor for every 20 prisoners. The ratio was staggering. The click of a pen filling charts, the stamp landing on individual files, everything documented. Remembering the improvised hospitals on the Russian front, where 1 doctor tended hundreds, the contrast cut deeper than any lecture. 6 loads of laundry washed each shift. The smell of soap filled the yard. Stacks of uniforms drying in the sun on stretched ropes. The cycle of cleanliness wasn't a luxury. It was routine. In Germany, bloodied shirts were rinsed in cold buckets and put back on the next day. And at the center of it all, hundreds of medical crates unloaded every night from ships. The snap of ropes, the groan of cranes, the thud of wood on the pier. An unbroken rhythm. How do you face a machine that never seems to miss a beat? Who could hope to stop a clock that refused to make an error? In the improvised quarters at Fort Dix, the yellow glow of a bulb hanging from the ceiling cast shadows across the notebook's pages. One of the German nurses, sitting on the edge of an iron bed, wrote with a trembling hand. The smell of disinfectant drifted from the hallway, mixing with the steam of soup served in the mess. Her pencil scratched out the words, "Nothing is missing here. Every time I think of asking, it is already before us. It is as if the war never reached this place." She folded the page carefully, hiding it under her pillow as if it were contraband. Days later, during the afternoon round, cold wind slipped in through the half-open window of the ward. One prisoner watched the Americans unloading K-ration boxes in the yard and muttered to her companion, low but loud enough to be heard, "While our men die for lack of morphine, they stack food and medicine like firewood." The metallic crash of crates hitting the ground marked the silence that followed. At a field hospital near Cherbourg, the roar of a generator filled the air, making the wooden floor vibrate. A German nurse, her apron already worn, held a metal cup warmed by freshly brewed coffee. She scribbled quickly on a card she kept in her pocket. "Nights here feel like days. The light never goes out, and the doctors change shifts like machines that don't stop. I don't know if I should admire or fear it." The words blurred when a drop of oil fell from the canvas ceiling onto the paper. In a warehouse in New York, the echo of cranes lifting crates onto the deck of a Liberty ship made the air tremble. One of the captives looked down at the polished floor and whispered almost to herself, "This isn't a depot. It's an entire city built to keep men alive." The glare of the searchlights cut across her tense face, caught between disbelief and resignation. The voices, sometimes in whispers, sometimes pressed onto scraps of paper, carried the same tone. Painful astonishment at a machine that never faltered. And in the repeated sounds of crates striking the pier, bulbs humming overhead, and clipboards stamping page after page, a larger truth echoed. These weren't isolated exceptions, but fragments of a pattern that was expanding in scale, far beyond the ability of any enemy to deny. The gaze that had begun in the bright ward of the military hospital now pulled back, reaching the machinery that sustained that abundance. In the darkness of a Pennsylvania dawn, a long whistle split the air as men in blue overalls crossed the foundry gates. The furnaces burned like underground suns, spitting heat and sparks over steel ingots. The air reeked of coal smoke and hot oil. A crane turned slowly. pouring molten ore into molds that shuddered with impact. The metal kept transforming. Red-hot bars slid over rollers, hissed under water jets until they became gleaming sheets. The aluminum assembly lines took shape just ahead. The hammering of rivets echoed in steady rhythm, each strike fastening plates to others until they formed entire hulls. Women with scarves tied around their heads moved along conveyor belts. Quick hands, focused faces. The white glow of floodlights revealed endless corridors of parts multiplying as if by themselves. Surgical instruments, K-ration boxes, M1 Garand barrels wrapped in oiled paper. At every whistle signaling a shift change, new ranks of workers replaced those leaving, and the metallic music of the presses went on without pause, indifferent to the clock. A stamp fell onto a letterhead form, the fresh ink still shining. The sheet was folded and attached to a wooden crate already on the move. From conveyor belt to olive green truck, from truck to a rail depot where rows of freight cars stood like sleeping giants. The locomotive's whistle mingled with the bite of iron wheels on track. The cars departed heavy with identical supplies, rushing through the night beneath electric poles that carved light into the darkness. At the port of New York, the cold cut into skin, but the cranes never rested. Chains clinked, crates rose and fell, wood cracked against the holds of Liberty ships. Each vessel loaded seemed to be instantly replaced by another arriving. Men rubbed greasy hands, boots struck the wet deck, the smell of salt mixed with diesel. From the docks the vision stretched wide. Fuel tanks lined in rows, stacks of tires piled high, cranes repeating the same arc across the sky like clock hands. Inside a converted passenger car, soldiers and prisoners traveled side by side, warmed by hot air blowing from ducts. The sway of the train matched the metallic clatter of cutlery in the improvised dining car. Out the window, American cities rolled past, lit up even in the dead of night. Movie theaters, USO clubs, industrial kitchens exhaling the smell of fresh bread. All parts of the same invisible network. From a telephone line vibrating in an office in Washington, orders crossed hundreds of miles to the Norfolk docks. From a clipboard signed in a Chicago warehouse, a crate of penicillin crossed the continent to reach a hospital in Normandy. Nothing stood alone. Each link called the next. The machine repeated itself with gear-like precision, indifferent to who was watching. The gaze pulled back further. Night into day, the industrial complexes lit up like entire cities. From above, rail cars glided like glowing veins. Ships crossed in constant routes. Factories breathed steady smoke. Command maps filled with red and blue pins. The sun rose over the port as one Liberty ship left the pier and another approached to dock. The world machine knew no pause. It turned, pulsed, and grew until everything converged in a single point. When those in the hospital, before endless shelves, would understand that they hadn't witnessed chance, but the inevitable face of a system moving as one. In the winter of 1945, the cold bit into hands and lips, but inside the makeshift mess hall at the prison camp, the scene carried another temperature. Electric lights hung from the low ceiling, shining over long wooden tables where hundreds of German nurses, now prisoners, sat in silence. The smell of fresh bread mingled with the steam rising from industrial pots at the back. The clatter of cutlery on metal trays was the only sound, until the doors opened and American soldiers began distributing K-rations and steaming plates in steady rhythm. It was a wordless choreography, repeated with such fluency it seemed rehearsed. At first, there were glances of disbelief. Some laughed softly, recalling the rumors spread at the front. Stories of Americans unable to keep discipline, dependent on machines that would never work in the field. But the laughter soon faded, swallowed by the strong smell of coffee poured from metal pitchers, by the steady hum of generators keeping the hall as bright as day. There were no interruptions, no hesitation. One soldier passed trays, another filled cups, another collected scraps, all like parts of the same invisible mechanism. The flow they had glimpsed in fragments, crates in warehouses, supplies at ports, lights that never dimmed, was now before them on a human scale, within reach of their own hunger. One woman lowered her head, remembering the field hospital in Italy, where a single loaf of bread was divided into 4 pieces, where a candle lit nighttime amputations. Beside her, another stared at her full tray, breathing deeply as if she couldn't believe it was routine. And then, the collective effect unfolded. The scattered noise of plates and voices ebbed until almost gone. The silence was not born of fear, but of recognition. Hundreds of eyes followed the same details, the steam rising from bowls, the electric light erasing the night beyond the windows, the repeated disciplined gestures of Americans serving meal after meal without failure. In the corner, a projector flickered on to show a USO film. The beam of light cut through the kitchen smoke and landed on the improvised screen, revealing images of lit cities, glowing factories, trains advancing in lines. The prisoners needed no translation. What they saw outside the camp was the same logic that now filled their plates. The skeptical laughter was gone, replaced by attentive stillness, as if all shared the same thought without needing to speak. Outside, a whistle blew, and in the distance the sound of a freight train carried through the frozen night. The locomotive's headlight pierced the dark for an instant before vanishing down the tracks. Inside the mess hall, no one spoke. The prisoners simply followed that light with their eyes, finally understanding it was no accident. It was the system itself in motion, undeniable. What had seemed impossible that first night, bright corridors, full shelves, endless supplies, revealed itself not as a fleeting trick, but as the natural breath of a system that never stopped. The prisoners, who once laughed in disbelief, now sat in silence before the same paradox turned routine. War sustained by an abundance that refused to fade. In the end, they understood that true strength did not lie in an isolated gesture, but in the steady rhythm of an entire machine. A light that stays on is harder to confront than any shadow. Spring 1947, a small town in Bavaria. Electricity flickered back through rebuilt houses, and in the narrow kitchen of a building with plaster still damp, a woman lit the coal stove. The smell of strong coffee filled the hallway, served in a dented metal mug she had kept since captivity, not for lack of dishes, but because the cold weight of the metal in her hand preserved a habit that remained, measuring the morning by bitterness and heat, just like in the mess halls where night never came. At the table, her husband folded the newspaper. The children waited silently for the first slice of bread. She arranged the table by instinct. Cutlery aligned, napkins folded, an invisible line forming for the cups. No one taught her this afterward. It had been learned under the constant hum of ceiling fans that still echoed at times in the back of her ear. Time moved on, and the apartment gained painted walls, framed photographs, a plant on the windowsill. One autumn Sunday, she opened the sideboard drawer and pulled out a hard-covered notebook. The pages smelled of old paper and cheap soap. There were folded letters inside, some begun but never sent, describing the lights of the mess hall, the full shelves, the way soldiers changed shifts without losing the beat. She reread a line with her head bowed, as if hearing a distant melody. The light never goes out. The sentence rested at the center of the page like an object. When she closed the notebook, the strip of paper marking her place slipped and fell. She picked it up carefully, as if it were fragile. The next summer, on a dusty street, a truck rolled by, slowly carrying crates to the reopened municipal hospital. In the back courtyard, she oversaw the laundry, now employed as shift supervisor. The room was simple, but it had order. Piles separated by size and use, ropes stretched across the yard, a clean table for folding. The younger women working with her laughed, chatted, lost their rhythm. Then a short gesture was enough, her palm opening and closing in the air, and the cadence returned. One of them asked where she had learned that way. The woman shrugged. From a place where there was always more. She didn't name it. She preferred the echo of what she had learned. At the end of the day, she wiped the wooden counters with a damp cloth and, without thinking, checked the edge with her fingertips, just as she had once done with metal trays before stacking them. Winter 1951. The hospital now had an operating room with new lights and a refrigerator humming quietly. She walked down the corridor with a simple clipboard, brown paper stamped with the administration seal, and logged entries and exits in steady handwriting. Sometimes her hand slipped by a millimeter, and when it did, she drew a deep breath, as if searching for a lost rhythm, and began again. The rooms shone with a brightness that hadn't existed before. It wasn't the endless abundance she had once seen, but it was a light that was enough, that persisted. In the drawers, the instruments gleamed with a thin layer of oil. When a vial or a roll of gauze was missing, she resisted the old impulse to improvise with rags. Instead, she called the depot, noted numbers, created a small line of waiting that moved. What had once been a distant machine had become a quiet method in her own body. On a rainy afternoon, she took her son to the cinema on the town square, a reopened hall with crooked chairs and a temperamental projector. The beam of light cut through dust and the images flickered. It didn't matter. She watched the improvised discipline of her neighbors, the ticket seller tearing stubs with the same motion, the young woman serving sweets with repeated gestures, the operator tapping the projector with a wrench always at the same spot. She smiled without showing teeth. She thought that sometimes it only takes a sequence of hands doing the same thing, in the same order, for the world not to collapse. When they left, the rain had stopped, and the street smelled of earth and oil. Decades later, with hair now white and the photographs on the wall faded, the woman opened the notebook again. The children were adults, the paint on the window frames peeling, the plant on the sill in need of water. She turned the pages like walking down an old corridor. She found, among the letters, a stack of forms she had smuggled from the camp, small boxes in rows, a line of spaces waiting for stamps. She placed one card on the table, and for a moment heard the crack of a stamp that wasn't there, the dry sound of approval that had once echoed through an entire warehouse. Then she closed her eyes and saw the shadowless white light on the ceiling, not as a haunting, but as the memory of a clock that worked. At certain dinners, when the family spoke loudly, she arranged the plates in the center and only ate after checking there was enough for everyone. No one noticed the gesture. When she once fell ill, she insisted the nurse wash her hands again and change her gloves, not harshly, but with the gaze of someone who had seen what happens when the sequence breaks. She was not searching for the old abundance. She defended, through small acts, the rhythm she had learned to recognize. At night, when she walked to the window before sleep, she saw the distant red light fixed to a tower at the station, flashing, fading, flashing. It was a modest light, but constant, reminding her of the illuminated corridor of another life. She did not know if it was happiness, justice, or only memory. She knew only that certain lights, once lit, never go out inside. And perhaps that is what remains, when everything else changes, the silent habit of keeping the world moving.